They laughed at me over lamb and wine, dismissing my ideas, mispronouncing my name, assuming I was someone's assistant. But by dessert, their smiles would curdle, because the woman they thought didn't belong, she owned everything they were pretending to run. If you've ever been underestimated, this story is for you. Subscribe now, because you won't want to miss what happens when silence becomes strategy, and revenge wears a power suit. The room smelled of wealth, aged whiskey, cologne that whispered generational money, and the faint sharpness of dry-cleaned wool. The private dining hall of the Argent was sealed tight, paneled in oak and arrogance. Around the glistening table sat 11 men, each with cufflinks more expensive than my first car. They didn't notice me when I entered. Or worse, they assumed I was there to serve. "Miss, could we get more Pellegrino?" one of them said without looking up. It would have been funny if it weren't so painfully familiar. I smiled. "I'm not staff." The man blinked at me, annoyed. "Then whose guest are you?" That one stung more than I expected. Before I could answer, the chairman of the board, Albert Crest, leaned forward, trying to recover from the awkwardness. "Gentlemen, this is Ms. Vale. She's observing tonight. A special advisor." Special advisor. That was the story we agreed on. The cover. I hadn't wanted to play it this way, but Albert insisted the timing wasn't right to reveal the truth, that some of these men, especially him, weren't ready. I took the only empty seat at the table. It was beside Carson Black, the presumed successor to the CEO role. If charisma had a scent, he wore it like armor. Chiseled jaw, tailored midnight suit, and that infuriating smirk that came with never having heard the word no. He turned to me with mock warmth. "A pleasure, Ms. Vale. I assume you've done some consulting for us before?" I held his gaze. "Something like that." He raised a glass of red. "Then here's to the shadows, where the real deals are made." The others laughed. I didn't. The evening unfolded in layers of subtle dismissal. They debated growth projections like they weren't gambling with the livelihoods of thousands. They joked about layoffs like cutting flesh from bone was a sport. And every time I offered a thought, carefully, precisely, they talked over me. At one point, Carson leaned in again, voice low. "You're quite brave, offering input without a title. Around here, power has a seat, and a nameplate." I could feel my nails dig into the linen napkin. Not yet, I thought. Not yet. There was a reason for all this. Months ago, when my father died, I inherited a controlling interest in the company he co-founded. What he didn't pass down was the respect he commanded. The board thought I was sentimental, a placeholder, a charity vote. They didn't know I'd spent the last decade rebuilding failed firms into powerhouses, or that my name, Isla Vale, was buried behind 3 shell entities that now controlled 61% of voting shares. I could have walked in as the new majority owner, but I wanted to know who they really were, unfiltered. I needed to see who bowed when they thought I had power, and who spat when they thought I didn't. Tonight was my evidence. And by the third course, some oversauced foie gras, Carson was deep into a monologue about leadership. "It's about instinct," he declared. "Not diversity quotas or emotional intelligence. Real leaders know when to cut dead weight, without apology." He looked at me when he said it. That's when Albert caught my eye from across the table. Just a flicker of silent solidarity. He knew I was close to the edge. I reached for my glass, but stopped short. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice low but clear, "what happens when the dead weight turns out to be the foundation?" A hush fell. They stared. Carson laughed first. "Is that a riddle?" I met his grin with ice. "No, it's a warning." The silence after my words stretched just long enough to sting. Albert, ever the diplomat, chuckled into his wine. Ms. Vale does have a way with metaphors. Laughter returned to the table, brittle and uneasy. Carson gave me another once-over, but this time his smirk faltered. Just a flicker, like he was starting to suspect the water beneath him wasn't as shallow as he thought. Good. Let him wonder. What none of them realized was that tonight's dinner wasn't a social courtesy or a performance review. It was a test, a final scan of a battlefield before I lit the fuse. And Carson? He wasn't just a smug obstacle. He was the reason I'd decided to take the company back. 2 months earlier, in a closed session without full board attendance, Carson and 2 of his allies pushed through a resolution to fast-track his promotion to CEO. It was technically legal, just barely, but profoundly unethical. My shares hadn't been disclosed at the time. My voting rights weren't counted. That was their loophole. They thought I wouldn't find out, but I did. And I didn't shout. I didn't threaten. I studied. I flew under the radar for weeks, watching, learning. I met with mid-level staff who'd been silenced. I reviewed contracts buried in back-office archives. I saw the patterns. Promotions traded for loyalty, vendor kickbacks, minor frauds that added up to a rotten core. And I waited. Until tonight. Albert cleared his throat as dessert plates arrived. Gold-flecked tiramisu that felt like insult on porcelain. "Before we wrap," he said, "I'd like to address a small procedural matter. A board ratification, actually." Carson arched a brow. "Now? Why not? Everyone's here. It'll take 5 minutes." I reached into my bag and removed a slim black folder. Carson's eyes flicked toward it, more curious than concerned. Albert continued, "We have a motion before the board to reassess the CEO succession plan, in light of some new developments." Carson's jaw tensed. "This wasn't on the agenda." "No," I said softly, flipping open the folder, "because if it had been, you'd have tried to kill it before it saw light." He narrowed his eyes at me. "Excuse me?" I removed the first document, an ownership ledger, then another, a vote proxy agreement, signed and notarized. Albert took over. "Effective as of last week, Ms. Vale's holdings have been consolidated under Vale Strategic Trust. She now controls the majority voting block." You could hear the air leave the room. Carson looked from me to Albert, then back again. "That's not possible." The Vale shares were fragmented, held by various non-active trusts and retirement funds. "I've seen the filings. You saw what I wanted you to see," I replied. "While you were busy admiring your own reflection, I was buying silence and shares." I stood slowly. I wanted them to feel this. For weeks, I let you speak over me, underestimate me, because I needed the truth. I needed to see if this board deserved to survive intact. I placed another document on the table. Spoiler alert, it doesn't. It was the motion. Official, binding, ready for vote. It called for a full review of executive conduct, including Carson's, complete with documented back-channel deals and misuse of discretionary budgets. I move for a formal vote to suspend the CEO appointment process pending an internal investigation, I said. "I second," Albert said immediately. The table exploded. "You can't do this," Carson barked, rising from his chair. "I can," I replied, calm as ever. "And I already did." They voted. One by one, hands raised, some reluctantly, some gratefully. The ones who didn't, they weren't stupid, just afraid of what else I might be holding. In the end, 8 voted yes, 2 abstained. Carson stood alone. When the gavel dropped, ceremonial, theatrical, it felt like thunder. The vote passed. Carson's face drained. He didn't look at me as he left. He didn't even look at his allies. Just grabbed his coat and vanished through the side door like a ghost in a tailored suit. As the room cleared, Albert lingered. "You're sure about this?" he asked. I was sure the moment Carson called me a seat filler. Albert chuckled, but there was sadness behind it. "You've won, but you'll lose some things too." "I know," I said, sliding the documents back into the folder, "but I'll lose them on my terms." The 2 days after the vote, I walked into the executive floor not as a ghost, but as gravity. People didn't look at me the same. Some whispered, some looked away. A few, braver, sharper, nodded. They knew. The balance had shifted. A seat at the table was one thing. Ownership was something else entirely. But I wasn't here to enjoy the power. I was here to clean house. Carson had vanished from the building. No formal resignation. No email. Just an empty office, locked and scrubbed. His assistant, Mara, had been reassigned. And yet, his presence lingered. In the unease, in the open files, in the missing audit trail. That's how I knew this wasn't over. The first file I opened was a contract renewal. HR consulting, 3-year retainer, 5 times above market rate. The second was a vendor agreement signed by a ghost entity, Clarendon Services LLC. No address, no site, just wire instructions to a bank in Cyprus. Sloppy, intentional. I sent both documents to the legal team and flagged them as urgent. Then I called in Arthur Lynn, our CTO, one of the few execs I still trusted. "I need everything Carson touched in the last 6 months," I told him. "Emails, calendar invites, off-record calls." Arthur hesitated. "That's a lot of data, and it'll raise flags." "Good," I said. "Let them wave." Behind every arrogant man is a tunnel he thinks no one else can see. What Arthur found in Carson's inbox confirmed it. Encrypted threads with outside brokers, internal asset reclassifications, expense reports buried under false project codes. The man hadn't just tried to steal power, he'd been siphoning funds, preparing for a separate empire, one he could run if this one burned. But what chilled me most was an email time-stamped one day before the board dinner. It was a message to a private investigator. Subject: dig on Vale. I stared at the screen. He'd known, or at least suspected, and he'd tried to get ahead of me. You underestimated me until the very last second, I thought, and still, you lost. But I wasn't naive enough to believe exposure alone would be justice. People like Carson always have lifelines. So I found mine, Marcy Diaz, our senior compliance officer. Sharp, unfazed, and famously allergic to corporate theater. I invited her to my office. You're not here to flatter me, I began. She smirked. No, I'm here because someone flagged your inquiry as unusual activity. I handed her a folder. Carson's back-channel records, vendor frauds, and the Clarendon Shell Company. This is just the surface, I said. I need your help going deeper. She scanned the papers, her expression unreadable. If this holds, she said slowly, we're talking felony-level embezzlement. I leaned forward. Then we hold it, and we bring it all the way to light. That night, I walked the empty halls, the city shimmering outside the windows like a memory I hadn't lived yet. I thought of my father, how he used to say, people don't reveal who they are under pressure. They reveal who they always were. Carson was always this man. The vote just pulled off his mask. I pulled out my phone and recorded a short voice memo. Not for press, not for records, for me. If you're listening to this, I said quietly, you know how it feels to be dismissed, to be talked over, to be the smartest person in the room, and the most invisible. But listen to me now. Don't stop. Build your silence into strategy. Let your story speak louder than your scars. And if this resonates with you, if you've ever had to rebuild yourself in the shadows, drop a comment. I read everyone. You don't have to own a company to own your power. Subscribe for the next chapter, because what comes next is war. Power doesn't vanish when it's taken. It echoes. Carson's shadow still loomed over the company, over the board, over me. Every email I received that week was a question in disguise. Every hallway greeting had a pause too long to be friendly. I wasn't paranoid. I was targeted. It started with whispers, anonymous reports filed against my leadership style, complaints about disruptive internal investigations. One even claimed I had violated board protocol by directing the compliance team independently, but I'd seen enough to recognize a smear campaign. What Carson couldn't beat with charm, he'd try to drown with chaos. Fine, I'd let him try, because while he sent shadows after me, I was building light. And Marcy returned with an update I'd both expected and dreaded, confirmation that Clarendon Services had received over $3.2 million in misappropriated funds, spread over 19 transfers, all signed off by Carson and 2 executives now very quiet. This is prison time, she said bluntly. If we go public, I tapped the folder she brought. We won't go public. She looked at me puzzled. We'll go surgical. A public scandal would fracture the company. Investors panic at the scent of rot. I wasn't here to burn down what my father built. I was here to cauterize it, quietly, irrevocably. So I called a special board meeting. And this time, I walked in last. In a white blazer. No notes, no folder, just presence. Carson wasn't there, but his allies were. Albert opened. Thank you all for making time. I raised a hand gently. I'll take it from here. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I laid out evidence, piece by piece, transaction trails, compliance statements, legal memos prepared by our retained counsel. And when I finished, I said nothing. Silence forced truth to echo. Finally, someone cleared their throat. What do you want us to do? I looked them each in the eye. Rescind the succession vote. Accept the internal investigation. And approve severance terminations for Carson's entire chain of misappropriated authority. And if we don't, came a voice from the corner. I release everything, I said, publicly, with your names in the CC line. They voted. Unanimously. I didn't smile. There was no triumph in cleaning rot from your inheritance. Just relief, just resolve. The next day, Carson's name was erased from the succession plan. His office was sealed, his access revoked. HR sent out a vague but ominous internal memo about organizational realignment. And me? I walked to the portrait wall, the long hall of founders and CEOs that had, until then, been exclusively male. There was a blank frame at the end, a nail already hammered into the wall. I pressed a post-it onto the glass. Soon. I don't share this to boast. I share it because someone out there is sitting at their own boardroom, voiceless, ignored, erased. If that's you, leave a comment. Tell me your story. You're not alone in this room anymore. And if you're ready to watch how power reclaims its name, subscribe now, because Carson wasn't done yet, and neither was I. It was Marcy who found it. 2 weeks had passed since Carson's quiet erasure from the company, and things were finally settling into something like order. HR compliance had implemented new oversight protocols. The board, while still tentative, was no longer hostile. I'd begun meeting with department heads, reinforcing stability. Trust was building. Then came the email. Subject line, "You'll want to see this. No body, just an attachment." Sapan dia. The file was buried in an archived hard drive from Carson's assistant's old laptop. The kind of thing someone forgot to wipe in the rush of exit interviews. A folder labeled C Strategy Final. Inside, among spreadsheets and memos, was a single Word document, Veil Contingency Protocol. The moment I opened it, my breath stilled. It wasn't just notes. It was a blueprint. Carson had been planning for war, in case I overstepped. He detailed my acquisition trail, how I'd silently bought voting shares, how Albert had helped restructure the trusts, how the proxies were signed. It was precise, dated, annotated. He had emails, timestamps, even photos of a private lunch between Albert and my trust advisor. This wasn't corporate awareness. This was surveillance. Worse still, it referenced something I'd buried deep, something I thought no one knew. 10 years ago, I'd led a merger negotiation between 2 manufacturing firms, Veil Dynamics and Ardent Forge. I'd been young, ambitious, and desperate to prove myself. In the final days of that deal, a junior analyst had flagged a discrepancy in Ardent's financials. I'd ignored it, pushed through the merger. 2 years later, the discrepancy turned into a full-blown embezzlement scandal. I'd escaped legally clean. But Carson, he had the thread. And if he pulled it publicly, he wouldn't need to win. He'd just need to taint me. And I stared at the document for a long time. Not with fear, but with fury. This wasn't just retaliation. This was excavation. He wasn't trying to regain power. He wanted to burn my name to the foundation. Salt the earth so I couldn't rebuild. In that night, I called Albert. He kept files, I said. More than we thought. There was a pause. Do they compromise your position? They compromise everything. Albert exhaled. We can't go to the board. Not yet. No, I said. We go to him. It wasn't hard to find Carson. Men like him never really disappear. They just downgrade. A tip from Arthur led us to a luxury co-working space in the Harbor District, where startups went to bleed slowly under soft lighting and artisanal coffee. I didn't send a lawyer. I went myself. Well, he looked up when I walked in, smiling like we were old lovers meeting for a tense reunion. Isla, he said. To what do I owe the intimidation? I dropped the document on his shared desk. His smile faded. I want everything, I said. Backups, hard drives, cloud passwords. Carson leaned back. You overestimate your leverage, and you underestimate my reach. He laughed softly, but it didn't reach his eyes. You've already won. Why are you still fighting? Because you didn't come for my job, Carson. You came for my name. Then we stared at each other, the way 2 wolves assess a wound. One delivered, one received. Then he shrugged. You'll never silence me. I don't need to, I replied. I just need to make sure no one listens. I left with his hard drive and a warning. Try me again, and I'll make sure your next office has bars on the windows. Later that night, I sat at my desk and opened the recovered files. There, amidst his drafts and vendettas, was a final audio note. Untitled. Just 19 seconds long. I pressed play. Carson's voice. If you're listening to this, Isla, you won. But not because you were better. Because you were willing to do what I wasn't. Enjoy the crown, Queen. It's heavier than it looks. He was wrong. The crown wasn't heavy. It was earned. And if you've ever carried a title others said you didn't deserve, comment below. Tell the world you're still standing. And if you're here for the next move, subscribe. Because the past isn't done with me yet. And neither is Carson. When you bury a secret, you don't just dig one grave, you dig two. One for the truth, and one for the part of yourself that let it happen. I hadn't thought about Maeva in years, until she showed up at the front desk of Vale Global, requesting a visitor badge. Arthur called me first. There's a woman here. Says you'll know who she is. What's her name? Maeva Ardent. My lungs tightened. Not because I was afraid of her, but because I wasn't sure I could still face her. Then 10 years ago, Maeva had been my counterpart on the Ardent Forge side of the merger. Younger than me, sharper in some ways. She was the one who sent me that flagged financial report. The red flag I ignored in the name of momentum. When the scandal broke, she didn't go down with the others. But she didn't rise either. She disappeared. Until now. When I met her in the lobby. She hadn't changed much. Still razor thin, still composed. But there was something harder in her eyes. Less polish. More steel. Isla, she said. You owe me coffee. And possibly the rest of my life, I thought. We sat in the corner cafe of the building. I noticed she'd brought nothing. No bag, no laptop. Just herself and something unsaid. I assume this isn't social, I said. No, she replied. I got a visit last week. Man in a tailored suit smells like entitlement. Said he wanted my version of the Ardent merger. Carson. She nodded. I didn't tell him anything, but I figured I should tell you. And I leaned back. Why now? Because I've been quiet for a decade, and it bought me nothing but obscurity and ulcers. And because I don't want that man twisting a mistake into a weapon. I stared at her. It wasn't a mistake. I knew better. I ignored it. Her eyebrow lifted. That your confession? No. It's my starting point. We talked for over an hour. She told me about what happened after the collapse, how she was quietly blacklisted, how no firm would touch her with Ardent on her resume. She'd gone back to school, restarted from scratch, reinvented herself. I always thought you forgot about me, she said softly. I couldn't, I replied. You were the reason I got smarter. I reached across the table. And maybe it's time we make that count. The later that day, I called Marcy and Arthur into my office. I want a full internal report released, I said, on the Ardent merger, with context, with names, with responsibility. Marcy blinked. You're admitting fault? I'm telling the truth. Before Carson gets the chance to tell a lie. Arthur leaned forward. That's risky. Transparency isn't always rewarded. No, I said, but silence is always punished. The report dropped 2 days later. I included a personal statement. My own words, no spin. I failed to act on information that could have prevented damage. That's on me. But I've spent the last decade rebuilding what I broke, and I won't let that past be twisted into someone else's power play. The reaction was instant. Press called it bold. Investors called it strategic. Staff called it overdue. And Carson, he called Albert. I thought you said she wouldn't risk it. Carson snapped over speakerphone. Albert's voice was level. You underestimated her again. You think this makes her untouchable. No, I think it makes her undeniable. Carson hung up. And that, I realized, was the moment I won something bigger than control. I won the right to own my story. Chasin Lin, if you've ever had to face your own failure, tell me below. That moment when you looked at the wreckage and still chose to rebuild. And if you're ready to see how this story escalates, subscribe. Because Carson's running out of moves, and I've only just started playing mine. When the system breach hit, it wasn't subtle. Arthur called me just past midnight. There's been unauthorized access, he said. Level 7 credentials. Yours. I didn't respond right away, because I knew it wasn't me. It was Carson. The security logs showed a remote login attempt, masked by a VPN in Switzerland, cloaked through a dead proxy server. Whoever had done it knew our architecture, our protocols, our fail-safes. They'd copied documents from the executive cloud, financial forecasts, vendor contracts, even board communications. But one file stood out. Vale Tempest Draft Confidential.pdf, a working draft of our upcoming acquisition, a multi-billion-dollar deal still under negotiation. If it leaked, the market would implode. The acquisition would die. The company would bleed. And Carson would get what he'd always wanted. Control through ruin. Apionitan. And I didn't sleep. I called a private security firm before dawn. Not PR, not lawyers. Digital forensics. Ex-military. Off-grid. Ruthlessly efficient. The kind of people who work in gloves and don't ask about motives. Within hours, they confirmed the breach came from a cloned machine. My old tablet, which I hadn't seen in over a month. The last place I remembered using it, the board dinner. The same night, Carson leaned close and said, "Around here, power has a seat." Marcy walked into my office mid-morning, holding a phone. "Bloomberg just posted an anonymous leak," she said, her face pale. She handed me the screen. It was a screenshot of the acquisition draft, cropped, watermarked, sent to a journalist from a burner account. I read the caption. "Sources say Vail Global's CEO-elect has concealed major risks in upcoming merger." I closed my eyes. This wasn't sabotage. This was an execution. But Carson miscalculated something. I wasn't scared of fallout. I was ready for it. Because 2 weeks ago, I'd quietly arranged a contingency. I didn't trust Carson to go quietly, and I'd assumed he'd try something desperate. So I reached out to someone even he hadn't seen coming, Maeva. And together we'd set a legal mousetrap, a sealed affidavit stored with our lawyers, tied to an internal sting. And part of that sting involved planting a nearly identical version of the Tempest draft on a decoy server. The draft Carson had stolen? It wasn't real. It was poison. Deliberately flawed. Legally tracked. Watermarked in invisible layers. And now, we had him. Misha, Dem. And we met with the Federal Compliance Unit that same afternoon. Arthur presented the logs. Marcy handled the financial impact brief. Maeva, calm and clinical, walked them through the breach trail. And I presented Carson's voice print, a recording from an internal chat weeks ago, where he'd bragged, offhandedly, to one of his old allies about seeing the Tempest file before the ink dries. In isolation, harmless. Combined with the breach, incriminating. Yeah, the agents left without comment, but I knew what came next. Carson was arrested 3 days later. Airport terminal, private gate, one-way ticket to Dubai. They never even let him board. It hit the press like lightning. Former CEO-elect accused in corporate espionage plot. Shareholders rallied behind me. Employees started posting messages of support. Even the board, now quiet and wary, gave me full backing for a public recovery campaign. The company didn't just survive, it hardened. Because a fire like Carson, it either consumes you or you learn to walk through it. And I sat alone in my office that night, the city glowing like a circuit board. And I realized the worst was over. Not because it stopped hurting, but because I stopped asking for permission to lead. And if you've ever had someone try to destroy what you built, drop a comment. You're not alone. Not in this war, not in this rise. And if you're still with me, subscribe. Because Chapter 8 isn't about Carson anymore. It's about what I do with everything I've won. Oh, victory is quiet. It doesn't arrive with fireworks or applause. It creeps in through silence, the kind that fills a hallway after everyone has gone home. The kind that lingers after your name stops trending, after the last headline fades, after the threat is gone. It had been 11 days since Carson's arrest. The breach investigation was over, the acquisition still intact. My position was unquestioned, my authority uncontested. And I couldn't sleep, not because I was afraid, because I was untethered. When you spend months in war mode, hunting betrayal, dodging sabotage, fighting to be believed, peace feels like a trap. Like the moment you exhale, something will crack through the glass. Arthur noticed first. "You've been in the office every night this week," he said, setting down a coffee on my desk. "It's done, Isla. He's gone." I looked at him, almost smiling. He's not the problem anymore. Arthur raised a brow. Then what is? I didn't answer right away, because the truth was this. Now that I had everything, I wasn't sure who I was without the fight. Marcy dropped by the next afternoon. Not with a compliance report this time, but with a bottle of wine and a question. "What's your next move?" I hesitated. The company was strong. The board was realigned. Our culture had shifted. People spoke up more, questioned louder. We were no longer pretending to be ethical. We were ethical, but a voice inside me whispered, "Now what?" I'd chased this throne for so long. I hadn't mapped what to do once I sat in it. I walked through the executive floor that evening, alone. Office lights dimmed, the hum of electronics and distant traffic filling the space. I passed Carson's old office, sealed, cold, and for the first time, I stopped in front of it. I reached for the doorknob, then paused, not out of fear, out of curiosity. It's inside. It smelled like dust and ambition. His desk was cleared. No files, no photos, just the faint outline where a monitor had once sat. But on the windowsill, half hidden, was a single object he'd left behind. A chess piece. The queen. White. Ceramic. Deliberately placed. A message or a mirror? I took it back to my office, held it under the light. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. I had become what Carson feared, what he tried to discredit, manipulate, erase. But I wasn't him, and I wouldn't lead like him. Then the next morning, I drafted a memo. It wasn't just a corporate update. It was a promise. We will not build our future on fear. We will not lead through silence. We will not rise by cutting others down. Our new era begins today, with accountability, with integrity, and with a seat for every voice that dares to speak truth to power. I sent it to every employee, every office, every region. Within hours, I received over 800 replies, not from executives, from receptionists, junior designers, tech support, from the invisible army Carson never saw coming. On that night, I finally went home. No calls, no inbox, just quiet. I poured a glass of wine, sat on my balcony, looked out at the city, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was guarding my life. I was living it. If you've ever had to rediscover who you are after the storm, leave a comment, because survival is one story, but becoming something new, that's the next chapter. And if you've stayed this far, subscribe. The empire isn't the end. It's the beginning. And trust is a strange currency. You earn it slowly, like rain filling a well. But when it's gone, it doesn't drain. It explodes. One whisper, one crack in the foundation, and suddenly everything feels hollow. It started with a line item, buried inside a monthly expense report, a charge to an outside law firm, Wexler & Rowe LLP, a firm we hadn't retained since the Carson fallout. Yet here it was, an $11,200 invoice, signed off by Albert Crest. At first I thought it was a clerical error. Albert had been my first ally, my buffer on the board. He'd risked his standing to support me when others still saw me as a placeholder. Without him, I may never have had the foothold to expose Carson, which is why the pit in my stomach felt like betrayal had teeth. And I asked Marcy to pull more records, 10 more payments, all under threshold for compliance alerts, all to Wexler & Rowe, all signed or approved by Albert. They dated back before Carson's arrest. Some dated before the vote. That's when I knew. This wasn't just paperwork. This was preparation. I confronted him in the board lounge, just after a quarterly update. "Albert," I said, closing the door behind us. "I need the truth, and I need it now." He didn't play dumb. He didn't even blink. Instead, he poured himself a scotch. "You're not going to like it," he said. "Try me." He set the glass down, deliberate. "Carson wasn't the only one who underestimated you. When you arrived, I thought you were smart. Yes, strategic, but not durable. I thought you'd burn out." I folded my arms. "So you hedged." "I protected the company," he said, tone shifting, "in case your rise came with recklessness." I wanted to scream. Instead, I kept my voice even. "What were they hired to do?" "Wexler & Rowe." "Monitor," he said. "Nothing illegal. Just quiet eyes. They flagged some things, ardent, the trust restructuring. I held the leash, and if I'd failed, he met my gaze. I had a succession plan. And there it was. Not betrayal in the explosive sense, but in the quieter, colder way. He believed in me, just not enough to bet on me. I left the lounge without a word, but inside, something cracked. Albert was the last person I trusted fully, the one who stayed when others scattered, and now even that thread had frayed. The empire I'd rebuilt, it was solid, but suddenly, it felt lonely. And that night, I sat at home, the city below a blur of red and white streaks, and I recorded another voice memo. Not for PR, not for press, for me. Leadership is a mirror, not of who you are, but what you lose to become it. Tonight, I lost my last belief in backup plans. There is no one left to catch me, so I won't fall. The next morning, I issued a quiet directive. Wexler & Rowe's contract was terminated. Albert wasn't removed. Not yet. But his votes on the board would never go unchecked again. If you've ever been betrayed by someone who said they'd stand by you, share it below. You don't have to name names. Just let the world know you're still standing. And if you're still with me, subscribe. Because Chapter 10, it's not about rebuilding anymore. It's about defending what I've built. They didn't come with pitchforks. They came in pressed suits, with polite smiles and loaded agendas. That's how shareholder rebellions start, not with fire, but with soft threats and scheduled meetings. The first sign was a sudden request for a governance review. Innocent on the surface, standard procedure, usually boring, but the email came signed by 9 minority shareholders, and 2 names stood out. Vincent Rourke, Danielle Farrow, both former allies of Carson, both conspicuously quiet during his downfall, both holding just enough stock to stir trouble, if not quite enough to dethrone me outright. Yet, Marcy delivered the news like a funeral notice. "They're questioning your concentration of power," she said, "and they've asked the board to consider rebalancing executive authority." I blinked. Translation? They want to create a co-chair model, split leadership, gut your vote control. Arthur, who was also in the room, looked grim. "It's elegant. It sounds democratic, but it's not. It's a coup," I said. He nodded. "In Kashmir." And I wasn't shocked. Not really. Because when you take power from those who believe they were born to hold it, they don't vanish. They evolve. Carson was a blade. These people, they were silk ropes tightening around the same throat. Mine. And I had 2 options. Fight back in the shadows, or answer publicly. So I called for an investor town hall. Live streamed. Unfiltered. Open questions allowed. It hadn't been done in company history. My advisors hated the idea, which is how I knew it was the right move. The night before the town hall, I stood in the empty broadcast studio we'd set up in the main office. The chair was waiting, the lights already warmed, my name on the lower third of the screen. I rehearsed nothing, because this wasn't performance. It was reckoning. The feed went live at 9 a.m. sharp. Attendance exceeded projections. Over 600 investors, dozens of media reps, thousands of employees watching silently. I opened simply. "Some of you want to know if I'm too powerful. Let me answer that, by showing you why I am." I walked them through the last 6 months. The silent acquisition of shares, the sabotage from within, the embezzlement uncovered, the failed breach and the arrest that followed, the restored value of our stock. I didn't flinch, didn't soften, because power isn't just what you hold, it's what you survive. How the Q&A came. Loaded questions, accusations phrased as concerns, soft jabs about collaborative leadership models. I answered each one, sharp but measured. Then, near the end, a new voice cut through the queue. Danielle Farrow, camera on, smile poised. "Ms. Vale, if your leadership style is so effective, why do so many of your former supporters now seek shared governance?" I stared straight into the lens. "Because some people mistake collaboration for control. I don't." A pause. And then I added, "And if you're seeking a co-chair to dilute my decisions, ask yourself this: do you want unity or an easy vote?" That clip went viral, not because it was flashy, because it was honest. The next day, 5 of the 9 rebel shareholders withdrew their petition. By the end of the week, the governance review was shelved, not dead, but buried, by confidence, by clarity, by truth said aloud. In the boardroom the next Monday, Albert approached me before the meeting started. "You took a risk," he said. "I took a stand," I corrected. He didn't argue, because now even he saw it. I wasn't holding power anymore. I was power. If you've ever had to defend your right to lead, comment below. Your voice matters more than you think. And if you're still watching, subscribe, because Chapter 11, that's where legacy becomes law. And the final meeting was supposed to be ceremonial, a vote to ratify the new bylaws, to codify the leadership structure I'd forged through fire and betrayal, to make the empire I'd defended impossible to steal, ever again. It was more than policy. It was armor, and I needed it in place before the end of quarter, before the next acquisition, before the press started asking who I was now that I wasn't under siege. But the past? It never checks the calendar. Arthur burst into my office 30 minutes before the vote. "There's a problem." I was already reaching for my tablet. "What kind?" "The kind with teeth," he said. "Someone's leaked a sealed arbitration file, one involving Carson, and someone else." He handed me a printed copy. I skimmed fast, and then stopped. Maeva. Now the document was dated 5 years ago. An internal conflict between Maeva and the leadership of a tech firm she consulted for, one partially backed by Carson's investment fund. She'd accused a senior executive of intellectual theft. He'd accused her of defamation. The arbitration was closed quietly, settled out of court. No admission of guilt, no public record, until now. Oh, I sat in silence, then picked up my phone and dialed her. Maeva answered on the second ring. Her voice was calm, but I could hear it. That old tension, pulled tight. "You've seen it," she said. "Yes. I didn't tell you because I thought it was over. I thought Carson took the only copy. He didn't." "No," she said. "But someone he knew did. And I had to make a decision. Fast. Delay the vote, and the board would smell panic. Push forward and risk appearing complicit. Or I could do what I'd done all along. Own the truth before anyone could weaponize it." And when the board meeting began, I walked in with nothing in my hands. No folder, no script, just one sentence echoing in my mind. "Your story is safest in your own voice." I opened the session not with an agenda, but with a confession. "I need to address something," I said, locking eyes with every person at that table. Someone tried to derail today's vote with a leak, a past arbitration involving someone I trust, someone who stood by me when others didn't. Gasps, shifts, whispered glances. I raised a hand. "You're wondering if that trust was misplaced?" It wasn't. Then I told them what Maeva had told me, about the theft, about the silence, about how many women get written out of their own work, and how few get to fight back. "She did what I did," I said. "She survived. And then she built again." I let the silence stretch, like a bridge. Then I added, "If that's disqualifying to you, I understand. But know this, I didn't get here by hiding from hard truths, and I won't start now." Albert was the first to speak. "I support the vote." Then Marcy. Then the rest. Unanimous. Afterward, Maeva met me in the corridor. "You didn't have to defend me," she said. "Yes," I replied. "I did. Because we don't rewrite legacy with silence." She looked down. "I thought it would haunt me forever." "It probably will," I said. "But now it's ours to use, not theirs." And that night, I updated the bylaws myself. Clause 9, Section D. No individual shall be deemed unfit for leadership on the basis of past conflict endured in the defense of ethical integrity. A new rule, for a new era, for people like us. Ines Sut. If someone has ever tried to drag your past into your future, tell me in the comments. Not for their sake, for yours. And if you've been here this long, subscribe. Because Chapter 12 is the epilogue they never expected, and the crown I carved from fire. If they call it the marble room, it was my father's office once. The floor, real Calicut stone. The ceiling, hand-plastered with soft swirls that catch morning light. The desk, oversized, monolithic, untouched since the day he passed. When I was a child, I thought it looked like a throne. Now I sit behind it, not as his daughter, but as the woman who rebuilt everything they tried to take from her. It's been 3 months since the final vote. 2 since Maeva's past became public. 1 since Carson was formally indicted. The company's stronger than it's ever been. The stock has stabilized. Press coverage has shifted, from scandal to strategy, from power struggles to the woman who rewrote the game. But this isn't about numbers anymore. It's about what comes after survival. Then today, I signed the last set of executive appointments. Internal promotions. Women, immigrants, working-class backgrounds, people who know what it's like to be laughed at in rooms like the one where I was humiliated. It felt like closing a loop. Not revenge, restoration. I still walk the halls alone sometimes. Not out of fear, out of memory. I pass the boardroom, the one where Carson smirked at me, the one where Albert questioned me, the one where I was told with a raised glass that power has a seat. I didn't take that seat. I built a new table and left room for others. Maeva and I now co-lead a mentorship initiative for women in finance. Not for branding, not for points, for legacy. Because I learned something in that fight. Real leadership isn't what you build in crisis. It's what you make possible for others once the crisis ends. There's one more place I go sometimes. The portrait hall. It took months, but the board finally approved the installation of a new piece. It hangs at the end of the corridor. Not a photo. A painting. Me, painted in oil, in full profile, blazer draped over the shoulder, gaze turned toward a window of light. It's not vanity, it's proof that I was here, that I stayed, that I won. If you followed this far, you already know. This isn't about one woman. It's about every person who's been talked over, shut down, written off. It's about reclaiming the narrative, the room, the crown. They laughed at me at the board dinner, and now they quote me. They defer. They remember, but I don't need their memory anymore, because I've written mine, in stone, in law, in marble, and for anyone still climbing, still fighting, I see you, and there's room for you at my table. Even if this story meant something to you, leave a comment. Your voice is part of this legacy now. And if you've stayed with me through all 12 chapters, subscribe, because this may be the end of one empire, but it's the beginning of yours. I once read that silence isn't the absence of sound, but the presence of everything unsaid. That's what the marble room feels like now. Not empty. Full of the laughter that once dismissed me, full of the whispers that doubted me, full of every voice that told me, in polite tones and closed doors, that I didn't belong here. And now, their chairs are empty. Mine is not. And it's funny. When you spend so long climbing, you start to believe the mountain is the goal, that reaching the summit is where the story ends. But it's not. Because once you arrive, the view forces a question. What will you build that wasn't there before? Yeah, in the months since the final vote, I've quietly transformed Vale Global from a fortress into a platform. We launched 3 new equity programs, one for early career women, one for founders from marginalized backgrounds, and one for survivors of corporate retaliation. I met a young woman last week, a finance intern from São Paulo. After my keynote, she approached me with eyes bright and jaw steady. "You made me believe I don't have to wait for permission," she said. I smiled, because that was always the point. Maeva and I now teach a quarterly seminar together. It's called The Silent Seat. We talk to women, to whistleblowers, to those who were once too strategic to be seen. We tell them, don't just demand a place at the table. Learn how the table was built. Then build your own. Albert retired quietly. We never had another personal conversation after the leak, but he left a note in his farewell email. "You were the lesson I needed to learn." I didn't reply. Some debts don't need repayment, only recognition. Gunnar Carson, he took a plea deal, 4 years probation, financial penalties, permanent disbarment from any publicly traded boardroom. I heard he's consulting now, quietly, under aliases. Let him. He's not my story anymore. Fund the company will outlive me. That's the mark of good leadership. When your absence won't topple what you've built. But legacy? Legacy is different. It's not what lives on when you're gone. It's what grows because you were here. Basta petuin. Sometimes I stand at the edge of the portrait hall and look at the faces behind me. My father, his co-founders, the men who believed vision came only with a Y chromosome. Then I look forward, to the next portrait, not yet filled. And I think, may she never have to bleed to be heard. May she never have to prove she belongs. May she build in peace, not war. So, this is the final message I leave behind. If they laugh at you, let them. Let them mock your ambition, question your presence, minimize your brilliance. Let them think you're just a shadow, a seat filler, an accident of circumstance. Then build, rise, and make them remember the moment their laughter died and your empire began. If this journey has mirrored your own, leave your story in the comments. Let your silence become someone else's courage. And if you've been here through every chapter, subscribe, because this may be my ending. But your beginning? It starts now.